The harsh cold of winter echoed through the narrow streets of St. Petersburg. The calendar showed the 22nd of December, 1849. Snow drifted slowly from the gray sky, and in a cold square, a group of men stood with their hands tied behind their backs. White shrouds covered their heads. Among them was one whose eyes carried both fear and a strange sense of peace, Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky. In just a few minutes, the rifles would be aimed at him, and perhaps the story of one of the world's greatest writers would end before it even began. But the rifles never fired. So how did this happen? And how did this moment change his life? Our story begins in Moscow. In 1821, Fyodor was born into a poor but cultured family. He spent his childhood in the garden of a hospital. His father was a doctor there, his mother a pious and affectionate woman. Right next to their home were the wards where death and suffering roamed. At a young age, Fyodor witnessed the fragility of life, the cold face of poverty and illness. This encounter engraved both compassion and the depth of suffering into his soul. He spent hours in the small family library with his siblings, losing himself in the lines of Pushkin and Karamzin. His mother noticed that he was an introverted, dreamy child. His father, however, was strict, authoritarian, even cruel at times. One of Fyodor's earliest conflicts began inside this home: mercy versus authority, freedom versus discipline. Perhaps the seeds of the father-son conflicts so often seen in his novels were planted right here. In his youth, he studied engineering, but his mind was always with literature. At the age of 25, his first novel, Poor Folk, was published. Critics hailed him as Russia's brightest hope after Gogol. Yet this hope soon gave way to a dark period. The year was 1849. Dostoevsky was a member of the Petrashevsky Circle, a group gathered around literature and ideas of freedom. Their tables held books, poems, long debates. But under the shadow of the Tsar, these ideas were considered dangerous. At that time, to think differently was not just a matter of opinion, it was seen as equal to treason. One morning, the sound of heavy boots echoed at his door. Tsarist soldiers arrested him. After months in prison, the verdict was clear: death penalty. On the morning of the 22nd of December, Dostoevsky and his comrades were brought to Simenovsky Square in St. Petersburg, dressed in white shrouds, their eyes blindfolded. Snow touched their faces silently as the executioners prepared their rifles. Dostoevsky believed he was living the last seconds of his life. Perhaps his childhood, his family, his first novel flashed before him. Perhaps he thought, everything ends now. At that very moment, an officer entered the square. He carried a message from the Tsar. The death sentence was pardoned, replaced with forced labor in Siberia. When the rifles were lowered, something inside Dostoevsky broke, and perhaps was reborn. Years later, he would recall the moment. In those 3 minutes, I loved life again. From now on, I will see every moment differently. Saved from execution, Dostoevsky now faced another sentence: exile in Siberia. By order of the Tsar, he spent 4 years in the labor camp of Omsk. Iron bars, wooden bunks, hands cracked from the cold. But what tormented him most was not days of chained labor. Living among criminals, murderers, and thieves forced him to peer into the darkest corners of the human soul. These years transformed Dostoevsky to the core. They made him not just a writer, but a surgeon of the human spirit. It was there that the idea of the depth suffering gives to man took root in his soul. This thought later came to life in works such as Crime and Punishment and Notes from Underground. When he returned from exile, life struck him hard again. Debts, disputes with publishers, endless financial troubles, and that ill-fated habit, roulette. In the small casinos of Germany, he found both thrill and destruction. Each time he sat at the table, he thought, "This time I will win," but most often he left empty-handed, losing even his last coin. In one letter he wrote, "I lost everything, and yet I will be there again tomorrow." Gambling was not merely about losing money, it was a reflection of his obsession with the fine line between loss and victory. This obsession took flesh in the gambler. But the true turning point of his life was about to arrive. The year was 1866. Dostoevsky was drowning in debt, his health failing, his mind exhausted. Creditors banged at his door, publishers awaited payment. His last bargaining chip was to write a new novel, but time was nearly gone. According to the contract, if he failed to deliver within a month, all the publishing rights to his works would belong to the publisher for life. For a writer, this was a fate worse than death. At that moment, fate opened another door. In Petersburg, there was a young stenography student, Anna Grigorievna. As a child, she had held Dostoevsky's books in her hands, reading them over and over, enchanted by his words. Never had she imagined she would meet such a writer one day, let alone hold a vital place in his life. At the advice of his friends, Dostoevsky called for Anna. The plan was simple. He would dictate the story, and Anna would transcribe it word for word. On the first day, papers were spread on the table, the stove smoked lightly in the dim room, snow fell outside the window. Dostoevsky took a deep breath and began. Anna immediately noticed the tone of his voice, weary yet filled with burning passion. As days passed, their bond deepened. While Dostoevsky recounted how gambling enslaved the human soul, Anna saw he was not merely a writer, but a man who had lived the story himself. Dostoevsky, on the other hand, found in Anna not only skill, but trust, comfort, and unshakable loyalty. Some evenings, the work stretched late into the night. Fatigue seeped into the room, yet neither wished to leave the table. At times, Dostoevsky would pause, saying, "Let's take a break." Anna would tidy the papers and bring him hot tea. In these breaks, Dostoevsky spoke of his years in exile, his childhood, his losses. As he spoke, Anna glimpsed his fragility. One evening, after finishing their work, Dostoevsky looked at Anna's hands. Her fingers were reddened from hours of holding the pen. Gently, he said, "Anna Grigorievna, without you, this novel would never have been finished. Perhaps I too would have been finished." They completed the novel. With The Gambler finished, Dostoevsky not only saved his contract, but also found the woman who would change the rest of his life. Soon he proposed. Anna accepted. This marriage proved one of the best decisions of his life. Anna became not only his wife, but also his greatest support, saving his life, health, and writing. In his final years, Dostoevsky was seen not just as a writer, but as the conscience of Russia. His novels became the center of debates, his ideas sparked both admiration and fierce criticism. But behind all this intellectual intensity, his body was wearing out. In 1880, his speech at the unveiling of Pushkin's monument cemented his place in literary history. Thousands listened as his words echoed across the square. This triumph was perhaps the last great stage of his life. When winter set in, his illness worsened. His frail body could no longer withstand Petersburg's cold. Anna never left his side. In his final days, Dostoevsky called his children to him, gave them advice for the future, kissed their hands again and again. On the morning of the 28th of January, 1881, his breathing grew heavy. Holding Anna's hands, he looked into her eyes and said, "Do not be afraid. Everything will be peaceful." That day, in the arms of the woman he loved, he passed away. His funeral was held at Alexander Nevsky Monastery in St. Petersburg. Tens of thousands poured into the streets to bid him farewell. Students, workers, nobles. Dostoevsky left behind not only great novels, but also a legacy that delved into the darkest and brightest depths of the human soul. Perhaps his story still whispers to us, even in the deepest pit, a person can be reborn. And sometimes, a single love can change the fate of a life.